Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and the precise time on your clock. Stories like this have a way of slipping through hours and borders, arriving when the night is deepest or the day is too bright to admit what it knows. Our path starts in Savannah, Georgia, in the spring of 1846, beneath a sun that bleaches color out of stone and politeness into faces. Johnson Square was already crowded when Elizabeth Mount stepped from her carriage, the silk of her morning dress cutting a clean line through the heat, lace gloves luminous against the dust. 6 months a widow, she had not come for company or consolation, she had come for hands. A plantation, even a stately one 7 miles outside town, could not pity itself into profit. Tobacco rows had collapsed into stubborn green disorder. Ledgers had grown numbers that marched the wrong way. Practicality, she had learned, has a sound, the snap of a ledger shut, when an expense can no longer be ignored. The auctioneer's voice clattered over the square, cataloguing bodies with the clinical certainty of a man practiced in reducing lives to measurable parts: back, teeth, scars, age, yield. Parasols tilted like white sails among Savannah's wealthy, their owners trying to ward off heat, odor, and conscience in equal measure. Elizabeth stood slightly apart, small leather notebook in hand, the morning's calculations scratched in a firm, narrow script. Her inheritance was ample but finite. A mistake today would echo through every column. When Lot 17 was led forward, conversation thinned to a hush sharp enough to notice. The man stood as if the shackles at his wrists were ceremonial rather than binding. His skin ran dark deeper than most in that market, and across his chest, thin, precise scars traced designs that were too deliberate for punishment and too old to be vanity. Then there were the eyes. They were a striking amber, and unlike others who let their gaze fall to the boards, he looked level, not defiant, not pleading, only lucid, as though taking in more than the square could hold. "Isaiah," the auctioneer said, voice flattening, as if the syllables had weight. "About 30, strong back, good teeth, no visible illness, trained in tobacco cultivation." He paused long enough for whispers to find one another. Previous owner, deceased, sold as part of an estate settlement. The pause lengthened into reluctance. Paddles that had shot up easily for earlier lots remained still. A woman in a citrus silk whispered behind her fan. A man in white linen pretended to study his ledger. The auctioneer cut the starting price. Silence held. He cut it again, and this time Elizabeth, who had been watching the man's posture and the unhurried way he breathed, lifted her chin. 200, she said, her voice precise, as if reading a figure already committed to paper. 200 from Mrs. Mount, the auctioneer repeated, grateful. "Do I hear 250? He did not. Eyes dropped further. The air thickened. Going once, twice. Sold to Mrs. Elizabeth Mount for 200. On her way to sign the papers, a familiar presence drifted to her side. Margaret Harrington, banker's wife, practiced in smiles edged with caution. "You should know, Lizzie," she murmured. "That one's been sold 3 times in 2 years." Each master met. Strange ends. Elizabeth's answer came with its own embedded calculus. "Thank you, Margaret. I am not superstitious. At that price, he is a bargain." She did not let herself pause over the word strange. Strange was a category for parish gossip and long summer evenings. Numbers did not fear it. Later, an entry in her diary would compress the moment into a ledger-clean line. "Acquired a new field hand today, Isaiah. Unusual in appearance but capable. Price below market. Concerns about character or health may be unfounded. We shall see." What her diary did not set down was the weight of the carriage on the rutted road, the way the man rode standing on the rear platform, hands still, eyes not on the horizon but on the trees that tunneled the path home. From the rise, the house emerged Georgian symmetry with tall columns, now showing neglect like bruises poorly hidden, paint peeling, garden overrun, verandas emptied of conversation. Even from a distance, the fields looked wrong, their lines wavered, growth uneven, as if the soil itself were tired of being told what to do. "My husband died in November," Elizabeth said, keeping her eyes on the house. "The overseer left soon after and took 3 of our best hands. Those remaining are mostly house servants or too old for field work. You have experience with tobacco. You will manage the fields and the 4 remaining men." She bracketed the last word. Report to me directly. The man gave a small nod she felt rather than saw. You'll stay in the northern cabin, she added. The former overseers. Work begins at dawn. Malachi met them at the steps, shoulders stooped from years, eyes quick with the kind of intelligence that survival teaches. Malachi will show you your quarters, she said, and dismissed them with the efficiency of an owner who intends to be obeyed. That evening, the kitchen's air held onion, steam, and low voices. Sarah, only 12, kneaded dough near the stove, listening the way a child learns to listen without eye contact. Those marks on him, Malachi murmured to Bessie, the cook, not whipping, not the lash, old marks. My grandmother talked about men with those. Said some of them walked with more than one shadow. Bessie hissed a warning hush. Miss Elizabeth is still in grief, but her hands trembled on the ladle. There were other stories Malachi carried, and these he shared later with the care of a man placing glass. One former master found in bed with eyes open and nothing behind them. Another who walked into the Savannah River at midnight, clothes on, pockets full. A third who ended himself in his study without known cause. Each time, the man named Isaiah left a household that spoke softly afterward, as if the walls, too, were listening. At 7 the next morning, a time Elizabeth chose because 7 was when her late husband's day had begun, and she intended, stubbornly, to keep the bones of order intact. Isaiah arrived at the main house. He carried himself not like a man seeking permission, but like one who had already assessed the work. In the study, now hers, the hunting trophies gone, and botanical prints where antlers once hung, she spread a field map she had drawn by hand, divisions marked, blighted corners circled. The rotation is wrong, he said after a careful look, his voice deep but contained, as if he measured each word for use and waste alike. He tapped 3 sections with a scarred finger. Tobacco drains the soil. Last year these should have grown legumes to give back what was taken. It was not the kind of analysis she expected. Most overseers acted as if Earth were a beast to be whipped, not a body with chemistry. Surprise flickered, then was stilled by opportunity wearing its work clothes. In her diary that night, Isaiah shows uncommon knowledge, speaks of nitrogen, of rest for soil, recommends changes, risk, ceding unusual authority, yet fields will not save themselves. Within a fortnight, the improvements became visible, unsettlingly fast. Rows straightened, tasks assigned by ability, not habit, tools repaired rather than replaced. From the upstairs gallery, Elizabeth watched the difference between shouted command and demonstrated technique. While her late husband had managed by volume, Isaiah managed by example. Hands followed him, not out of fear, but in the uncanny quiet that surrounds competence. Yet the kitchen remained uneasy. Houseworkers stepped aside when he passed, eyes skimming the floor not as deference, but as avoidance. Only Malachi spoke with him on the back steps at dusk low, even tones that ceased whenever anyone came near. Sarah, promoted to attending Elizabeth after the previous maid quit from illness, the word spreading like smoke, noticed other changes. The way Elizabeth asked for field updates more often, first in the study with its doors properly open, then in the east conservatory among the foreign plants her husband had mocked as wasteful. Between pages in the diary, herb sprigs were pressed and labeled in tidy script, some tagged simply IB. It was the first time Elizabeth did not write his name in full. There are decisions that appear in a life like a turn in a corridor you thought you knew. Elizabeth would later formalize hers with a ledger sentence, no longer than a breath. Isaiah to supervise both fields and domestic operations. Efficiency demands central control. The house took the news the way cloth takes dye, completely and unevenly. 2 younger servants disappeared before dawn, choosing the punishing road over a home that had ceased to feel like one. By then, even Elizabeth had begun to dream, the scars along Isaiah's chest rearranging into characters she almost understood, a script older than her church pews and the language spoken from them. Across town, Margaret Harrington might have said it was foolishness, a widow's loneliness woven into fantasy. In the kitchen, Malachi tied a small pouch around Sarah's neck, salt, and an iron nail polished by fingers, saying nothing, only tightening the knot with a care that said everything. In her study, Elizabeth closed her diary on a line that betrayed the very order she claimed to prize. We shall see. If this was prudence speaking, it sounded remarkably like curiosity. Outside, dusk drew its veil over the fields. and for a moment, standing at the window, Elizabeth thought she smelled something sweet, too sweet, like overripe fruit ripening again. She told herself it was the garden gone wild. She told herself many reasonable things. Reason is a comfort you keep until the land asks for another kind of payment. At first light, the next morning, the plantation wore its neglect plainly, as if untidy rooms had strolled out to greet the day. Paint shed in brittle curls from the veranda rail, vines clutched the stair balusters like pleading hands, and the front lawn had ceased to be a lawn, choosing instead the democracy of weeds. From the upstairs gallery, Elizabeth stood with her ledger and a cup of tea she did not drink, watching the way the fields lay wrong, rows drifted, furrows blurred, as though the earth had grown tired of imitation order. She kept appointments like promises to herself. At 7 sharp, Isaiah crossed the yard with an unhurried stride, and the stillness of a man who does not broadcast his intentions. In the study, she had already unrolled the field map and set out the plantation's account books with quills sharpened to points. It calmed her to arrange things in lines, numbers, tools, thoughts. The former overseer had preferred volume to planning. She intended to make a new economy where foresight would buy back what shouting had squandered. "Begin with the east field," she said, indicating a quadrant circled in pencil. "Drainage is poor. The plants yellowed before frost. We'll need a replanting plan by week's end." "The soil is starved," he answered, scanning the map as if it were a body. "You can see it on the leaves, thin, sallow, the way a man looks on salt pork all winter. We'll run legumes, then tobacco after the rain." "How many days?" she asked, automatically translating advice into a schedule into cost. 10 for turning and ditching if tools hold, he said. Shorter if the men are assigned by skill, not habit. He spoke the way a carpenter handles wood, measuring, not guessing. She noted the cadence in her mind with a small surprise, and then, as was her way, she pushed surprise aside into a column labeled useful. She told herself she did not need to like him, she needed the fields to obey. He walked the ground that afternoon with Malachi, who carried a coil of line, and the look of a man braced for stories repeating themselves. Sarah trailed at a distance, sent by the house to fetch messages and to satisfy her own curiosity about the marks on Isaiah's chest she had glimpsed in the kitchen steam. She watched him kneel and press soil between thumb and forefinger, bring it to his nose, crumble it, and let it fall as if listening to the sound of dirt breaking. He scratched shallow trenches with a mattock to show how water should move and how the wind had bullied the rows into bad habits. When a tool split, he did not demand a new one. He mended its handle with a wedge and a strip of boiled leather, hands working with a competence that quieted the men around him. By evening he had chalked a plan on a rough plank propped against the cabin wall. Ditch lines, turning sequences, a simple rotation, cowpea or bean, where tobacco had stripped the ground. Compost pits dug at the north edge to catch kitchen scraps and stable sweepings. Elizabeth, who mistrusted improvisation, found herself strangely relieved by the sight of a diagram that looked like thought given a shape. The house, however, received him like a chill draft. Bessie set his supper on the table by the back door without meeting his eyes. The footman who had learned to ferry trays upstairs on silent feet stepped wider of him than the path required. Even the hounds, great foolish beasts who loved any hand that would rub their ears, came close, sniffed and reconsidered, as if discovering in him a smell they recognized from older, less comfortable stories. In the kitchen's heat, Malachi spoke low enough that the ladle's scrape could cover it. "He knows the land," he said, "knows it like reading. But those marks on him, my grandmother's tongue had a name for men who wore those. She said their prayers were like knots. Once tied right, they held." Bessie made the sign she kept forwarding off talk that might grow teeth. "Hush, Malachi. Miss Elizabeth is holding to her work with both hands. The house does not need another kind of trouble." Elizabeth's diary that night translated misgiving into arithmetic. Assigned authority to Isaiah for field schedule. Observed practical knowledge. Rotation, drainage, composting. Risk. Granting latitude beyond station might unsettle house hierarchy. Counterweight. Projected yield increase offsets risk if discipline holds. On the facing page, where she sometimes copied phrases from botany books to steady her mind, she wrote a single word, and underlined it twice times necessary asterisk. The next days unwound like a rope pulled from a well, steady, then faster. Isaiah woke before dawn, not with noise but with a sound-like decision. He divided the 4 remaining field hands by what they did best. The tallest to ditching, the surest to setting lines, the patient to mending. He demonstrated without flair, showing a technique once and once was enough. When a mistake was made, he did not shout. He placed a hand over a hand and corrected the angle. The men began to anticipate rather than wait for orders. From the gallery, Elizabeth charted the pattern of his motion. He wasted nothing. Her late husband had filled the fields with himself, his temper, his voice, the hard swing of his arm. In the end, he had collapsed into that performance like a staged wall kicked too often. Isaiah's authority, by contrast, was the kind that rearranged other people rather than announcing itself. Efficiency always appealed to her. She disliked the word times, charisma times, because it could not be entered in a ledger, but she recognized its effect when the wheels greased themselves. At her desk, she recalculated costs, seed ordered against a legume plan, hired wagons postponed, repairs done with what was at hand. She wrote to a factor in town for a small order of cowpea and for a briefer, polite note times, seasonal tests, experimental rotation times that would protect her from gossip. Should anyone ask why she was planting food where cash had been expected, she was learning that prudence sometimes wore the mask of mild deception. In the evenings, she called Isaiah to report. At first, she kept the door of the study open, the way a woman in her position was expected to leave a conversation ventilated by propriety. Soon she asked him to step into the conservatory where the air held damp light and heavy leaves breathed a different green. Her husband had despised the room, a menagerie for plants, he'd called it, and this still pleased her more than she admitted. There among the palms and the blowing fern, she listened to a language from the other side of cultivation. Nitrogen returned, the rhythm of rest, the discipline of not demanding from living systems what they could not give. When she wrote IB in the margin beside a pressed sprig, she told herself it was simply shorthand. The house adjusted and did not. Trays arrived and vanished at odd tempos. A maid left with a note saying an aunt was ill in Macon, though she had no aunt there. Someone began lining the window sashes with rue and rosemary. The smell crawled into curtains. Sarah woke one night to find a coarse little pouch under her pillow salt and a nail, iron red from many fingers, its thread tied off in a knot that was not hers. She wore it to humor Malachi and said it pinched, though secretly she touched it when the wind scuffed along the eaves and made a sound like whispers trading places. On the second Sunday, Elizabeth drove the property with Isaiah walking beside the carriage rather than riding it. He stopped at the lowest corner of the east field and pointed to a shallow channel he had cut. "The water will move where it is shown," he said, "if you do not pretend it respects maps." He paused and added, "Men are like that too." She did not answer, but later, in the privacy of the study, she wrote, "He speaks in comparisons. The habit suggests thought and a view beyond immediate work. This can be dangerous in a man of his station, or invaluable in a manager. Economy must choose." The first rain came soft, as if the sky had learned courtesy. In the morning, Elizabeth smelled the earth deepening, green sharpened at the edge of sight. The men moved like a team that knew its harness. Even Bessie admitted, grudging, that the kitchen's scrap bin had never emptied so efficiently. Peels and stems now marched away to the new pits and returned as something that smelled like beginnings. News travels in slave quarters the way water travels in roots, quietly and everywhere. In the nights, when the lamp was turned low and the last pan set aside, talk threaded itself through rafters and pallets. About the new man with eyes like amber, about the way he could stand without making the air crowd around him, about the itch some felt between the shoulder blades when he passed, as if their bodies remembered a posture they had once held and put down. "Not a devil," Malachi said when asked outright by a boy too bold for his age. "A man, but a man with old company. Respect that and mind your own shadow." When Elizabeth dreamed, the dreams did not announce themselves as omens. They arrived like memoranda from a distant office, clear, legible. In one, she stood in the east field and saw the scars on Isaiah's chest reorder themselves into tidy characters, not unlike the botanical annotations she made. except they refused to fix their meaning when she tried to read them. In another, she walked the northern ridge and found the soil warm underfoot, as if something living had just moved through it. She woke embarrassed by her own imagination and wrote in the morning margin, "The mind exhausts itself with fancies when the day demands only work." If there was a line to be kept, she intended to keep it. Owner and manager, ledger and field. Yet lines slip where land is concerned. Every farmer knows this, even if they deny it. On the 12th day, when Isaiah proposed consolidating both field and domestic schedules under one hand, she did not say no. She said, "Efficiency demands central control," and the words felt reasonable in her mouth because they were. Reason, she thought, was a banner that could be carried over any terrain. 2 servants fled that night. Their absence left spaces that refused to be filled. The house creaked in new ways, as if the wood had learned a different weather. Elizabeth held to tasks, to ink, to the rhythm of steps on the gallery. But once, briefly, at the stairs' turn, she paused. The air carried a sweetness that did not belong to the kitchen or the garden. It was cloying, like fruit left too long in a bowl, still insisting it was beautiful. She told herself it was nothing. She had told herself useful things her whole life. They had mostly done as they were told. The trouble with some truths is that they do not obey. Morning returned with the sound of labor. The rhythmic chop of hoes struck through mist, joined by the low murmur of men pacing each other's movements. From the veranda, Elizabeth Mount stood silent, ledger pressed against her chest, as the first order began to settle on the land. The disorder her late husband had left was slowly rearranging itself, not under her voice, but under Isaiah's quiet precision. He did not raise his tone. When he spoke, his words landed softly but left no room for confusion. The men obeyed because his direction carried something deeper than command. It carried coherence, as if he were reminding the world of a pattern it had forgotten. By the second week, the rows had straightened, and the soil, newly turned, gave off a scent more alive than it had in years. Elizabeth marked each improvement in her account book. Increase in germination, 18%. Drainage restored in East Field. Waste reduced to minimal. Her handwriting remained crisp, yet she could not ignore the faint tremor she felt when copying Isaiah's suggestions into her margins. She had been raised to believe intellect among the enslaved was an anomaly, an indulgence of missionaries and philosophers. Yet here was proof otherwise, speaking with calm logic about nitrogen and legume rotations, as though these had always been the language of the field. It was impossible not to admire the efficiency, and admiration, when left unguarded, begins to blur its edges. In the kitchen, rumors fermented faster than bread. Bessie muttered that the new overseer, though no whip hung at his side, had the air of someone who knows too much. Sarah listened from her stool, pretending to polish brass. The girl was growing bold in silence. She noticed how the field hands no longer cursed under their breath, how even the horses grew still when Isaiah passed. It was as though the plantation itself had started listening to him. Malachi, older and slower now, shook his head at every sign of order. "Work moving too smooth," he whispered to Bessie. "That's when you start worrying. It's when the river's quiet that it's deepest." Elizabeth's meetings with Isaiah became routine morning reports in the study, evening summaries before supper. At first, she kept her distance, addressing him while seated behind her desk, quill poised like a weapon between them. But by June, her guard had softened, the distance shrinking until both stood beside the same map, shoulder to shoulder, tracing the future of the Mount fields. "Here," Isaiah said one afternoon, tapping a worn section of parchment. "The soil near the northern fence, see the discoloration. It's richer beneath, where the old creek used to run. We should plant there next." Elizabeth leaned closer. "That land hasn't been tilled since before my marriage." "Then it's ready," he replied. His voice was low, certain, almost tender. Some things grow better after they've been left alone. The line sat heavy in the room, too intimate for a discussion of soil. For a moment, Elizabeth forgot she was mistress, and he, property. It was a silence neither dared to name, so they filled it with talk of logistics until the air cooled again. By midsummer, Mount Plantation had taken on a strange vitality. Travelers passing on the road remarked how the fields, once gray and patchy, now shimmered green even under harsh light. Leaves glowed with health that seemed almost luminous. Yet within the house, that same vitality became tension. Servants whispered of noises after dark, soft hums rising from the fields, not wind, not insects, but something deliberate, like chanting carried by the soil. One evening, as lanterns flickered low, Bessie crossed herself 3 times before speaking to Malachi. "He don't pray like us," she said. "When he goes out, he talks to the earth. Sometimes the ground talks back." Malachi did not argue. He had seen the faint patterns carved at the field edges, curved lines drawn in ash, repeating in cycles. Not the crosses of the church, not the marks of a plough. Older shapes, older than the English tongue. In her diary, Elizabeth wrote, "Is greater than, efficiency thrives, output surpasses expectation, yet staff unsettled claims of night sounds, unverified." Isaiah continues to demonstrate strong leadership, though methods unorthodox. I note a personal curiosity toward his symbols appear botanical but patterned, perhaps agricultural shorthand of African origin. She paused, pen hovering, then added, "As greater than, there is discipline even in mystery. Perhaps the land responds to those who listen differently." That sentence she underlined twice. As the days lengthened, Elizabeth found excuses to summon Isaiah to the house more often. At first, she asked about seed counts and soil moisture. Then, about weather signs and crop rotation. But gradually, her questions drifted elsewhere, to stories of the old country, to languages she had never heard. He spoke of them with the gravity of a man reciting scripture. "There are words older than prayer," he said one afternoon in the conservatory. "Words that bind things together, wind, root, and blood. Some call them curses, others songs. It depends on who's listening." The way he said times blood times made her pulse quicken. The conservatory became their meeting ground, a glass house where George's sun melted through and painted them both in gold and shadow. There, surrounded by the faint perfume of imported orchids and the slow drip of condensation, propriety began to thin. Elizabeth removed her gloves more often, pretending the air was too warm. She noticed the network of pale scars running down Isaiah's forearm, those same deliberate patterns Malachi had whispered about. "What do they mean?" she asked once. Unable to restrain herself, he looked at her without hesitation. "They're stories," he said, "written on the skin when the mouth could no longer speak." Her fingers hovered near the markings, almost touching. "Stories of what?" "Of what was lost," he answered, "and what waits to be found again." The faint tremor in her hand was not fear. That evening, her diary shifted in tone. "Is greater than Isaiah's insight surpasses even my husband's. His understanding of growth, spiritual and physical, seems inherited from some older order of knowledge. He speaks of the earth as if it remembers. I begin to believe it does." Later entries blurred practicality with fascination. Pages once devoted to crop statistics now shared space with pressed leaves, labeled in Latin beside cryptic initials, *IB*. To an investigator decades later, it would appear the first hint of intimacy hidden within the professional record, a secret folded between the lines of duty. The shift in authority did not go unnoticed. House servants moved quietly, steps measured and eyes averted. They no longer used Isaiah's name. They called him the man from nowhere. 2 refused to stay past sunset, whispering that the fields breathed wrong after dark. By late June, both had vanished without trace, one into the woods, another downriver, leaving behind only a broken lantern and a trail of footprints that stopped at the creek's edge. Elizabeth, reading the reports, dismissed them as cowardice. But her own handwriting betrayed uncertainty. "Is greater than 2 absconded. Isaiah to oversee both field and domestic operations until replacements secured. Efficiency demands central control." The phrasing was practical, almost mechanical. Yet below it, in smaller script, she added, "Is greater than, order requires a single will." It was unclear whose will she meant. That night, Sarah awoke to a sound she could not name, neither animal nor human. From her window, she saw faint light rippling across the northern field, as if lanterns moved in deliberate patterns. For a moment she thought she saw 2 figures, one tall, one slender, standing in the glow, their shadows merging into a single shape before vanishing into darkness. In the kitchen, Bessie wept quietly into her apron. "The land's remembering things best left buried," she murmured. And in her room, Elizabeth Mount sat upright in bed, ink still wet on her fingertips, whispering the same line Isaiah had spoken hours earlier, half prayer, half revelation. Some things grow better after they've been left alone. The air in the room smelled faintly of tobacco, though no pipe had been lit in months. By late June, the air on the Mount Plantation grew heavy with rain that never came. Each afternoon the horizon gathered thunderheads, swollen and purple, but they drifted away at dusk, leaving the earth trembling with thirst. Elizabeth noted the anomaly in her diary, barometer falling yet no rain, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "The plants, however, thrive." The tobacco leaves stood taller than a man's shoulder now, glistening with a dew that formed even on dry nights. When the wind passed, their broad surfaces made a sound like breathing. Something was happening on the land, and everyone could feel it. Within the main house, decorum began to fray. Servants whispered of strange schedules, Miss Elizabeth requesting Isaiah's presence long after sundown, lamps still burning in the East Conservatory past midnight. At first, it was explained away: planning, account balancing, the business of a widow trying to save her estate. But by July, the explanations felt thin. Sarah, now promoted to Elizabeth's personal attendant after the previous maid's abrupt departure, saw the changes firsthand. The mistress's eyes, once sharp and calculating, seemed distant, as though she were looking at something beyond the walls. Her handwriting, formerly precise, now drifted into looping shapes that resembled no English script. One night, Sarah was sent to the conservatory with tea. She hesitated at the door when she heard voices, Elizabeth's low, curious tone, and Isaiah's deeper, measured cadence. "The marks are language, you said." Elizabeth's voice trembled slightly. "Yes," Isaiah answered, "a language that speaks to what the world hides, not written to be read, but to be felt." Sarah peeked through the glass. The scene glowed under lantern light. Isaiah's shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his forearms bared. Across his skin ran the intricate scars, lines, circles, spirals intersecting like the geometry of storms. Elizabeth stood before him, her gloves off, fingertips grazing the markings with an almost reverent slowness. "They look like maps," she whispered. "In a way they are," he replied. "Each one tells where the spirit has traveled." Her hand lingered longer than politeness would allow. Sarah fled before she was seen, her pulse hammering, certain that whatever she had witnessed was not meant for mortal eyes. The following morning, Elizabeth made an announcement that rippled through the household like a clap of thunder. "Malachi will be relieved of his duties as head of staff," she declared over breakfast. "Isaiah will oversee both field and domestic operations, effective immediately. Efficiency demands unity." Her tone left no room for debate, but the effect was immediate silence thick enough to choke. Malachi stood motionless, his wrinkled hands tightening around his cap. He did not protest. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, murmured, "Yes, Miss Elizabeth," and left the room without another word. Bessie's ladle dropped into the pot with a dull splash. That night, 2 house servants fled into the darkness, their footprints vanishing at the marsh's edge. No one went after them. The hierarchy of the Mount household had been rewritten in a single sentence, and though the words were practical, everyone felt the tremor beneath them. Isaiah now moved freely between house and field, his presence constant, his voice even. But his eyes, those strange amber eyes, seemed to see too much. Elizabeth, meanwhile, wrote more feverishly than ever. Her diary entries became cryptic, the language shifting from commerce to confession. "Is greater than. IB has shown me patterns in the soil. They answer to certain sounds. He says memory runs deep, older than blood, older than faith. The land has listened for centuries. It only needs someone to speak the right words." On the next page, another passage. "Is greater than. We have begun preparations. The earth must be readied. As above, so below, so he says. I have drawn the symbols as instructed. My hand no longer shakes." She no longer wrote of markets or seed prices. She wrote of alignment, resonance, and power. The atmosphere inside the mansion grew oppressive. Curtains remained drawn even at noon. The faint smell of tobacco, sweet and wrong, clung to the corridors, as though the fields had begun exhaling through the house. Sarah noticed that her mistress had stopped eating the meals prepared in the kitchen. Instead, Isaiah brought her strange concoctions, roots and leaves boiled in clay pots, their steam carrying a scent like decay and honey combined. When Bessie once tried to empty one such pot, her hands broke out in a red rash that burned for days. "The earth don't want our meddling," she muttered, wrapping her palms in linen. "Something's turning here, child, and it ain't the crops." At dusk, Isaiah often walked the perimeter of the property alone. Sarah watched from the attic window as he moved along the fence line, pausing at intervals to press his hands into the soil. From where she stood, it looked as though the earth pulsed faintly under his touch. Sometimes Elizabeth joined him, her pale dress a ghostly shimmer beside his dark form. They never carried lanterns, yet they walked as if guided by light only they could see. Those who remained in the house began hanging charms from their beds, iron nails tied with string, pouches of salt. The older servants spoke in fragments of old Africa, words like times obaifo asterisk, asase asterisk, memory of ground asterisk. They prayed quietly, not for forgiveness, but for distance. One evening, as thunder rolled without rain, Sarah found Elizabeth at her desk, sketching with unusual intensity. On the paper spread before her was a spiral design, repeating in perfect symmetry, surrounded by letters that were not English, not even Latin. "Miss Elizabeth?" she asked softly. Elizabeth looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Sarah, do you hear it?" "Hear what, ma'am?" "The sound the earth makes when it's breathing." Sarah forced a nod, though she heard nothing. Elizabeth dipped her pen again and whispered, "IB says it's almost ready." By the second week of July, Mount Plantation had transformed from a failing estate into something that defied explanation. The crops flourished beyond logic, the leaves so dark and lustrous they looked wet, even under sunlight. Neighbors stopped visiting, claiming illness or road damage. Deliveries were left at the gate and collected by Isaiah at dusk. The plantation had grown, self-contained, and yet within that strange order was a quiet dread. Dogs barked at nothing, then fell silent as if scolded by an unseen presence. The air itself seemed to hum, vibrating with something alive and impatient. Malachi, now reduced to stable work, spoke to no one except his daughter. One night, as lightning flickered far off, he pulled Sarah close and whispered, "When the land starts answering back, child, you best not listen too hard." Sarah would remember those words for the rest of her life because by the next month, the land would speak in a voice that could no longer be ignored. August came without mercy. The Georgia air hung thick, too heavy to breathe, and even the birds grew silent at midday. The fields, however, seemed untouched by the suffocating heat. The tobacco grew faster than anyone could account for, taller, broader, its veins pulsing faintly as though blood instead of sap ran through them. Travelers on the old Savannah Road began crossing themselves when they passed Mount Plantation. They said the air turned strange half a mile before the gate, sweet like overripe fruit, but edged with something rotten underneath. Horses balked, refusing to move. Local children whispered that the land itself had started eating light. Elizabeth wrote in her diary with an urgency bordering on rapture, "Is greater than, the crops prosper beyond measure. Isaiah says the soil is awakening. He shows me the old ways of offering blood, ash, and word. The boundaries between life and decay are not opposites, only phases of the same rhythm." I believe him. Her handwriting trembled, but not from fear. Inside the house, the servants spoke little, but their silence carried a pulse of panic. Bessie nailed iron keys above every doorway. Sarah found salt poured in perfect circles near her bed each night, though she never saw who placed it. Malachi wore a small pouch of iron nails on a leather cord around his neck and forbade Sarah from walking near the northern fields. When she asked why, his answer was grim, "Because things there don't die right anymore." He wouldn't say more. At dusk, Elizabeth and Isaiah walked the fields together. Lanterns were no longer needed. An unnatural phosphorescence shimmered among the plants, faint but visible, like moonlight trapped beneath the leaves. Isaiah moved in silence, his hands grazing the soil, whispering to it in a tongue Sarah could not recognize. Sometimes he cut small slits into the stalks and pressed his thumb against them. The plants seemed to quiver in response. Elizabeth followed him without hesitation, her face serene, almost entranced. When they reached the center of the field, she removed her gloves and knelt beside him. "It's alive," she murmured. Isaiah smiled. "It always was, but it needed to be remembered." He reached into a pouch and drew out a mixture of dark powder and something glistening, salted earth, perhaps, or ash. Together they scattered it in a circle and began to chant in low, alternating voices. From her hiding place at the tree line, Sarah watched, unable to move. The sound was wrong, too slow, too steady, like the hum of something enormous and buried beneath the soil. When the wind changed, the scent reached her, tobacco, copper, and the faint sweetness of decay. She ran until her breath tore. The next morning, Elizabeth appeared at breakfast radiant, speaking lightly of new vitality in the fields. She ate nothing, only drank a dark infusion Isaiah had prepared. Her eyes shone feverishly bright. "Your appetite, Miss Elizabeth?" Bessie asked. "The earth feeds me now," she replied calmly, and returned to her ledger. That was the last time Bessie ever addressed her directly. Within days, the plantation changed shape. Paths that once led to the barn now curved inexplicably toward the marsh. The creek along the eastern border, once predictable, had altered course, cutting a new path through the lower meadow. Malachi stared at the change in disbelief. "Rivers don't move that fast," he said quietly, "not unless something's pushing from underneath." Even the animals sensed it. Cows refused to graze, chickens stopped laying, dogs hid under porches, whining softly as if they could smell something that humans could not. Sarah began to hear whispers at night, snatches of words in no language she knew, carried by the wind through cracks in the shutters. Sometimes she awoke to faint scratching beneath her floorboards, rhythmic and deliberate. One morning, she found faint symbols drawn in dust along the windowsill, spirals, circles, and slanted lines filled with ash. She wiped them away with shaking hands, but the marks reappeared the next night. In the north field, the strangest sight of all appeared. Some plants had developed streaks of deep crimson along their leaves, as though veins of blood ran through them. Malachi swore he saw the tallest stalks move against the wind, bending toward the house. When he tried to cut one, his blade snapped clean in two. He went to Elizabeth to warn her. She listened with calm interest, then said only, "Some things resist because they remember pain. Leave them be." Malachi left her office trembling. That night he gathered the household staff in the kitchen, his voice low and urgent. "No one goes out alone after dark," he said. "No one opens a door if you hear your name called. If you see a light in the field, you don't look at it." Bessie crossed herself 3 times. "What's happening here?" Malachi's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "The old marks," he whispered. "They're not drawings, they're invitations." Meanwhile, Elizabeth's diary entries grew increasingly unstable. "Is greater than IB says the alignment nears. The stars shift as the ancestors once foretold. The soil must be fed, not just seed and ash, but life itself. He says the land is hungry and that hunger is holy." The next page contained only a single phrase written over and over. Asterisk. "What the Colonel tried to force through cruelty, I will achieve through understanding." Asterisk. In the margins, a new symbol appeared, 3 concentric circles, with a single vertical line cutting through the center. Later, investigators would find that same mark carved into the tobacco stalks. The closer September drew, the more the plantation withdrew from the world. Letters to Savannah went unanswered, or perhaps were never sent. Deliveries stopped. The few who passed by claimed to hear low singing from the fields at night, though no voices were visible. And when the moon rose full, the land itself seemed to shimmer faintly like breath against glass. Sarah, clutching the iron charm her father had given her, watched from the attic window as Elizabeth and Isaiah stood side by side beneath the moonlight, their faces turned toward the sky, lips moving in unison. From that moment on, she would never again think of prayer as something safe. The day of September 23rd, 1846, began with stillness so complete it seemed the world was holding its breath. Not a leaf moved, not a bird sang. Even the servants, those who had not fled, moved through the halls like sleepwalkers. Sarah would later recall that the air itself felt thick, as if filled with invisible threads. Elizabeth spent that morning in her study, the shutters closed, the room heavy with the smell of ink, wax, and something sharper, tobacco and blood, blended in the strange tonic she now brewed daily. When Sarah entered to deliver tea, she found her mistress hunched over the diary, writing not words but symbols, loops, spirals, interlocking lines that looked like a map of storms. "Shall I open the windows, ma'am?" she asked. Elizabeth did not look up. "No, the light would interfere. The alignment requires darkness." Sarah hesitated. "The alignment?" Elizabeth's hand paused only long enough to answer, "Tonight, everything connects." By sundown, the tension had reached breaking point. The dogs began howling in their kennels, then fell eerily silent. The remaining servants, 5 souls in all, gathered in the kitchen. Bessie prayed aloud, Malachi clutching his iron charm with trembling hands. Outside, the sky turned the color of bruised copper. At precisely 10 o'clock, Elizabeth descended the main staircase wearing a plain white shift. Her hair, usually pinned in the manner of widows, hung loose over her shoulders. In her hands, she carried a brass bowl and a bundle of dried herbs. Isaiah waited at the base of the steps, his expression calm, his shirt open to reveal the web of scars glowing faintly in the candlelight. "You're ready," he said. "I have never been more certain," she replied. Together, they walked through the front doors and into the night. Sarah followed at a distance, barefoot, her fear outweighing her reason. The air outside was unnaturally warm, the sky heavy with clouds that did not move. The moon shone behind them, half-veiled but unnaturally bright, casting a cold light over the fields. The tobacco stretched ahead in perfect rows, yet at the center, something seemed wrong. The plants were bending inward, as if bowing toward an unseen point. From that dark center came a low vibration that Sarah could feel in her chest, like the hum of distant thunder buried underground. She hid behind the low stone wall as Elizabeth and Isaiah entered the field. Elizabeth knelt, setting the brass bowl upon the soil. The bowl reflected the moonlight so intensely it looked aflame. Isaiah took a knife from his belt, drew it across his palm, and let the blood fall into the bowl. Sarah's breath caught. Elizabeth reached out her own hand, unflinching, and did the same. Their mingled blood turned the liquid black. Isaiah stirred it with a small branch, chanting in a deep, rhythmic tone that made the air tremble. Elizabeth's voice joined his, softer but insistent. Sarah could not understand the words, syllables that rose and fell like the tide, but they carried the weight of something ancient, something meant to be obeyed. The ground began to move. At first, it was subtle, a ripple through the rows of tobacco. Then, suddenly, the soil shuddered, as if something beneath was awakening. The plants quivered violently, their leaves rustling in waves. From the brass bowl, a faint blue light began to rise, swirling upward into a column of smoke. Sarah clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Isaiah lifted his arms to the sky, and the scars across his chest blazed with pale fire. Elizabeth's head fell back, her eyes wide, glowing faintly. Together they chanted faster, the words overlapping until language itself collapsed into pure sound. The wind rose in an instant, hot and sharp, tearing through the field, carrying with it a smell both sweet and putrid. It filled Sarah's nose and lungs until she nearly fainted. Then came the light blue and white, flashing like heat lightning, bursting from the soil and spreading through the field in concentric waves. The tobacco leaves began to blacken. Sarah fled. She stumbled through the brush, branches clawing at her arms, until she reached the safety of the kitchen steps. Behind her, the entire field seemed to sigh a long, exhaling sound that ended in silence. Then, nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind. Only the echo of the chant lingering in her ears. When dawn came, the plantation looked as though winter had descended overnight. Every leaf in the tobacco field was shriveled and black. The soil was dark and wet, glistening as if with oil. The air smelled of ash and sweetness combined, an odor that made the throat close. There was no sign of Elizabeth or Isaiah. Malachi, after long hesitation, gathered what remained of the staff and approached the field. They found the brass bowl at the center, half buried, its interior burned to glass. Around it lay shallow impressions, almost like footprints but not human. The shape was wrong, elongated, fading as they watched. The search of the house took the rest of the day. It was Sarah who finally found Elizabeth sitting upright in the cellar, her white dress smeared with soot, her diary open in her lap. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead, pupils huge and unblinking. "Miss Elizabeth," Sarah whispered. No response. The physician summoned from Savannah recorded her pulse as steady, her breathing normal, but her awareness entirely absent. "She lives," he wrote, "but the essence of self is vacant, as though displaced." Isaiah Boone was never found. The surrounding woods were searched, the river dredged, but not a single trace appeared. Rumor said the soil had swallowed him whole. The following week, The local sheriff sealed the property pending inquiry, but the investigation was brief, superficial. The Mounts were an old family. Discretion was considered mercy. The official cause listed in the records: mental collapse due to nervous exhaustion following agricultural misfortune. Privately, the sheriff told his wife he had never seen soil that color. By winter, Elizabeth had been committed to the Georgia State Hospital in Milledgeville. She spoke no words, but sometimes, the nurses claimed, she traced patterns on her arms, patterns that resembled the same scars once seen on Isaiah Boone. Her diary was collected as evidence, though several pages were missing. The final surviving entry read, "Is greater than. Tonight, we finish what was started centuries ago, interrupted by chains, by oceans, by the severing of sacred memory. The alignment is perfect. The tobacco will carry what was offered. When burned, it will open the path." He says this is not an ending, but a beginning. The ink bled at the edges, as if written by a trembling hand or by one no longer fully human. For decades after, no one farmed the Mount land again. Locals swore the soil never dried, even in summer, and that sometimes at dusk, a faint blue light could still be seen over the field. Sarah would never speak of that night again until her old age, when she confessed to her own daughter, "I saw them walk into the earth, child, not sink walk." Like the land opened and took them home. The disaster at Mount Plantation might have ended with that September night, an isolated tragedy wrapped in superstition had it not been for what came after. For while the fields lay black and the house rotted in silence, the tobacco itself did not die. Weeks later, Elizabeth's cousin, Charles Mount, arrived from Charleston to claim the estate. He was a pragmatic man, with little patience for ghost stories, and even less for female hysteria, as he called it. He saw only value rotting in the ground. Against warnings from locals, he ordered the surviving crop harvested, dried, and sold to market under the old plantation name. By the spring of 1847, Mount Plantation tobacco was burning in pipes and parlors across Savannah, Charleston, and Richmond, and with it, something unseen began to travel. The first cases seemed unconnected. A wealthy planter's wife in Augusta began speaking in an unfamiliar language after smoking a new batch of tobacco. She claimed it was the speech of her grandmother's grandmother. In Savannah, a judge known for his rational mind suddenly collapsed mid-sentence, only to awaken 3 hours later, calling himself Times Kessi Ado *, a warrior of the Ashanti, describing in perfect detail a battle that had taken place in 1798, details later confirmed by shipping logs of captured Africans brought to Georgia that very year. Newspapers called it tobacco madness. Doctors blamed heat, humidity, or contaminated leaves. But no explanation held, because every victim shared two traits. They had smoked Mount Plantation tobacco, and they all spoke in tongues that predated their births. One physician, Dr. Everett Chambers of Richmond, became obsessed with the phenomenon. A devout man of science, he dismissed talk of curses and spirits. Instead, he hypothesized that the soil at Mount had absorbed hallucinogenic compounds. He collected samples stolen from the evidence vault after the investigation quietly ended and began his own study. His journals, later recovered from the ashes of his burned laboratory, tell a stranger story. As greater than, the leaves retain unusual vitality even after drying, he wrote. Under magnification, cell structures show motion slow but deliberate. When burned, smoke particles form patterns reminiscent of writing, not random, structured, purposeful. Soon after, Chambers reported hearing whispers while observing the samples. He called them memory echoes. He wrote of waking at his desk, speaking a dialect he could not identify, one that feels like prayer and warning intertwined. By October 1849, his laboratory had burned to the ground. Every patient under his care perished, their eyes open, pupils wide, faces serene. Chambers himself was found seated upright, pulse steady, breathing normal, mind gone. The report described his condition as a living absence, the same words once used for Elizabeth Mount. Authorities ordered all remaining Mount tobacco destroyed. Yet small caches survived, kept as curiosities by those who had witnessed its effects. In Charleston, a merchant refused to burn his stock and continued selling it in secret. Within months, 5 of his customers were dead, each after claiming to see through other eyes. The merchant disappeared soon after, his store abandoned, a single line scrawled on the ledger. Asterisk, the leaves remember. Asterisk, in Savannah, Judge William Harrington, the husband of Margaret, the woman who once warned Elizabeth not to buy Isaiah, became one of the most infamous cases. At a dinner party in April 1847, he lit a pipe filled with Mount tobacco and joked about the haunted leaves. Moments later, he grew pale, excused himself, and returned half an hour later transformed. Witnesses recalled that he spoke softly at first, in an unfamiliar language, then in broken English. "This is not my house," he said. "This is not my time." He identified himself as Times Kessie Addo, Times the same name spoken by the Augusta woman weeks before. He described the hold of a slave ship called Times, the Mercy asterisk, the suffocating dark, the drums before capture, the names of those taken beside him. Every detail matched shipping manifests from 1798. For 3 days he remained trapped in that identity. When he awoke, he remembered nothing, but refused ever to smoke again. By midsummer, dozens of similar reports had surfaced. In some, victims described vivid dreams of West African villages, rivers, and rituals they could not possibly know. Others spoke of a tall man with amber eyes, visiting them in smoke, whispering words they did not understand but could not forget. Doctors in Georgia and South Carolina exchanged letters warning of an epidemic of identity displacement. One wrote despairingly, "It is as though the souls of the dead have found paths through the living." The final confirmation came from an unlikely source, an enslaved field hand named Ruth on a neighboring plantation, who fell into a trance after inhaling tobacco smoke from her overseer's cigar. When she awoke, she described a vision of the mistress in white and the man of the marks, standing side by side in the ruined field. The man said, Ruth whispered to the others, "The path is open." The exchange begun. The more the afflicted spoke, the clearer the pattern became. The tobacco seemed to carry consciousness, memory, identity, fragments of lives severed by slavery and time-seeking return. Those who inhaled it became temporary vessels for something ancient and unfinished. Dr. Chambers had hinted at this before his death. "Is greater than, the smoke acts as conduit," he wrote. "It binds the breath of the living to the breath of the forgotten. The boundary between them is thinner than science admits." When the newspapers finally stopped printing stories, people assumed the madness had passed. But within the archives of the Georgia State Hospital lies a file marked ***, Case Mount E, ***. An attached note by a physician in 1858 reads, "Is greater than, after 12 years, Mrs. Mount remains alive yet vacant. Occasionally, one feels observed when near her, an impression not unlike being studied. I sometimes think the mind is not absent, merely elsewhere. Sometimes, when I look into her eyes, I sense something behind them looking back and waiting." By 1850, the Mount plantation had burned. No one claimed responsibility. Some said lightning struck the house during a storm. Others said they saw a figure walking through the flames, untouched, the light of the fire reflecting gold in his eyes. Whatever the truth, the land was never tilled again. The soil turned black and slick, the weeds refusing even to sprout. Locals called it the dead acre. Travelers swore they could still smell the tobacco sweet, thick, clinging to their clothes for days afterward. And sometimes, in the smoke of their pipes, faces appeared watching, whispering, remembering. The Mount plantation might have ended in ash, but its shadow refused to stay buried. In the years that followed, whispers began to rise along the eastern seaboard, stories of a man who appeared without introduction, spoke with a preacher's fire, and vanished before dawn. His skin was darker than coal, his eyes the color of amber glass. On his forearms ran scars shaped like runes, lines that shifted under candlelight. They called him the Vessel Keeper. In Charleston, 1861, a freedman congregation gathered under a crumbling roof near the waterfront. The war was young then, and hope hung thin in the humid air. A stranger appeared at the door, tall, quiet, dressed in worn black. He carried no Bible, yet when he spoke, the words moved like scripture. He told us, one survivor later recalled, that heaven was not above but beneath that. The ground carried the voices of our kin, waiting to rise. The man stayed 3 nights, teaching prayers that were not quite prayers, chants laced with rhythm and breath, each ending in the same refrain. Asterisk, the land remembers. Asterisk, on the fourth night, he was gone. The next morning, the Confederate supply store 2 streets away was found in flames. Reports like these scattered across the next 2 decades from Norfolk to Baltimore, even as far north as Boston. Each account described a figure matching Isaiah Boone, unchanged by time, moving among the newly freed and the forgotten, teaching them songs that spoke of return and reclamation. Wherever he went, someone in power soon fell ill, disappeared, or confessed to crimes long buried. And then, as always, he vanished. In 1878, during renovations of a boarding house once used by the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, workers found a small leather-bound notebook hidden within the wall. Its pages held botanical drawings, roots, leaves, and unfamiliar plants annotated with precise measurements. Between these sketches ran lines of text written in 2 hands, one firm and angular, the other softer, slanted, unmistakably feminine. The first was signed Times I.B. asterisk. The second, asterisk E.M. asterisk. Handwriting analysis decades later confirmed it Elizabeth Mount's pen, the same as the diary that had chronicled her descent. Yet these entries were different. They spoke not of madness, but of revelation. Is greater than, the vessels are nearly full. Each leaf carries a memory, each breath returns a voice once silenced. The last page contained only a single inscription, is greater than, from the soil of Mount free in all ways that matter. Time wore away the plantation, but the land beneath refused erasure. By the end of the 19th century, investors sought to reclaim it first for cotton, then for timber. None succeeded. In 1893, a northern industrialist purchased the acreage for a textile mill. When his crew began digging the foundation, they uncovered a circular stone structure beneath the surface, carved with a fusion of African and Native American designs. Archaeologists from Savannah declared it a ritual well, purpose unknown. 3 workers entered to examine it. Only one returned, incoherent and trembling. His hair had turned completely white. The next day, the project was abandoned. Locals began calling the area Times the Hollow Ground. Asterisk. Decades passed. Nature swallowed what was left. The fields, the house, the cellar, where Elizabeth had Saturday. Only a few stone steps remained, leading nowhere. Yet every attempt to map the property failed. Compass needles spun, survey stakes shifted overnight. Some claimed that the land itself changed shape, folding its borders like a living thing unwilling to be pinned down. In 1922, the Georgia Historical Society tried to document the legend. They found almost nothing. County records had been destroyed in a fire, deeds rewritten, testimonies missing pages. Only fragments survived. A weathered page of Elizabeth's diary, the sheriff's brief report, and one chilling note from a surveyor. Is greater than, there is movement underground, not water, not roots. It pulses when the moon is full. 30 years later, Emory University sent a research team to study the soil and water composition of the Mount property. The results were published in a small journal under the title Asterisk, Environmental Anomalies in Coastal Georgia. Asterisk. They found that the soil's chemical makeup changed from day to day. Samples taken in the morning bore different molecular structures by nightfall. Water from the nearby creek contained organic compounds that reorganized under observation, forming patterns resembling cellular replication. More disturbing were the audio recordings. Microphones left overnight captured faint voices, layers of whispering in English, Fante, and unknown dialects. When played backward, a single phrase emerged clearly. Asterisk. The exchange is not complete. Asterisk. The lead researcher, Dr. Marion Prescott, wrote in a private letter never meant for publication. Was greater than, this land breathes. It remembers the hands that worked it, the pain it absorbed, and it answers back. It defies time, refusing to decay because the story it carries is unfinished. She resigned from the university 2 months later. Then came the incident of 1968. Thomas Harrison, a graduate student at Emory, set out to write his thesis on folklore and memory in antebellum plantations. He camped on the Mount property alone for 3 nights. Only his notebook survived, its final entry written in increasingly erratic handwriting. is greater than 3:27 a.m., awakened by woman's voice from the direction of the old foundation. Followed sound through mist, smell of tobacco, sweet, heavy, found clearing where stones barely visible under moss. Woman in white standing there, eyes vacant. She turned, spoke. He has almost gathered enough vessels. Then saw him tall, dark, eyes of amber. His skin shimmered like smoke. He said, "Some debts can only be repaid in kind. Some justice transcends time." Smoke entered me. Felt something move aside inside. Last thought times I am becoming a vessel. Asterisk. Harrison was found 20 miles away the next morning, barefoot, delirious, his tent untouched. He remembered nothing after the voice. Within a month, he had withdrawn from his program and booked passage to Ghana. Embassy records confirmed his arrival in Accra, but after that, he disappeared completely. No further expeditions were permitted after that. The Mount property was labeled Times Protected Wetlands, asterisk its boundaries sealed under state preservation orders, yet locals swore they still saw a tall figure walking the perimeter at dusk, sometimes alone, sometimes beside a woman in white, whose eyes reflected no light. Those who ventured too close returned pale, smelling faintly of tobacco, claiming they had dreamt of other lives, lives that felt truer than their own. And always, the dreams ended with the same whisper, asterisk, the land remembers, asterisk. For more than a century, the story of Mount Plantation lay buried beneath layers of polite silence and southern denial. The locals called it cursed land and built their lives around its borders rather than through it. But some histories refuse erasure. Some memories lie in wait, patient, restless, breathing just beneath the roots. In 2003, the quiet was broken. A tobacco company executive named Richard Caldwell purchased several acres of the Mount property with plans to launch an organic heritage farm, reviving old varieties of Georgian leaf for luxury markets. His team cleared brush, mapped the boundaries, and planted the first rows in April. By June, something had changed in him. He began keeping a private journal, later donated to the Georgia Historical Society after his disappearance. "Is greater than, the land resists cultivation," he wrote. "Tools rust overnight. The workers complain of whispering in the soil. I dream of faces. I've never seen faces, both mournful and waiting. They speak through smoke." Caldwell resigned from the company 3 months later. He sold all his assets, founded a non-profit, and dedicated the remainder of his life to tracing the genealogies of enslaved Africans transported through the ports of Savannah. When a journalist asked what caused such a dramatic shift, his reply was simple. "Is greater than, some debts can never be paid, but acknowledgement is the start of justice. The land remembers, and so must we." The foundation he created, asterisk, the Return and Reclaim Initiative, asterisk, has since helped over 3,000 African-American families trace their ancestry to individuals once enslaved in the American South. For each confirmed connection, a tree is planted along the boundary of the Mount property, each bearing a small ceramic plaque with a name and 3 words. Asterisk, remembered, reclaimed, returned, asterisk.